I never thought a single phone call could shatter my world so completely. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was sprawled on my worn leather couch, thumbing through a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird when my cell phone buzzed. Dad's name flashed across the screen, and I felt a flutter of excitement. We hadn't spoken in a while, and I was eager to catch up. "Hey, Dad," I answered, my voice bright with anticipation. "Hey, kiddo," he replied, his tone oddly hesitant. "Have you been?" We exchanged pleasantries, talking about my job at the local bookstore and his work at the law firm. It felt like old times, almost. But there was an undercurrent of tension in his voice that I couldn't quite place. "Listen, Sarah," he said after a pause that stretched a beat too long. "I've got some news." My heart quickened. Good news? Bad news? The possibilities raced through my mind. "I got married last weekend," he continued, his words hitting me like a punch to the gut. It was a small party, just family and close friends. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Married? Last weekend? And I wasn't there?" "Oh," I managed to choke out. "Congratulations." The conversation that followed was a blur. Dad rambled on about how it had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, how they'd wanted to keep it low-key. But all I could focus on was the deafening silence where an invitation should have been. As soon as we hung up, I retreated to my bedroom, my safe haven since childhood. The walls were still adorned with faded posters and photographs, remnants of a time when Dad and I were inseparable. I sank onto my bed, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on my nightstand, a gift from Dad on my 16th birthday. Each tick felt like an accusation. Tick. You weren't important enough. Talk. He didn't want you there. I reached for my phone, scrolling through our recent text messages. There were no hints, no clues that could have prepared me for this bombshell. Just mundane exchanges about work and the weather, peppered with the occasional, "Miss you, kiddo," that now felt hollow and insincere. As the reality of the situation sank in, my mind began to race, replaying every interaction we'd had over the past few months. There was the time he'd canceled our weekly dinner because of work commitments. The weekend getaway he'd postponed indefinitely. The gradual decrease in phone calls and text messages. It all made sense now, fitting together like pieces of a painful puzzle. I thought about his new wife, Linda, he'd said her name was. I'd met her once, briefly, at a company picnic last summer. She seemed nice enough, with her warm smile and easy laugh. But now, the memory of that meeting took on a different hue. Had they already been planning this then? Had I been the only one unaware of the seismic shift happening in my father's life? The hurt gave way to anger as the night wore on. I paced my room, alternating between furious tears and stunned disbelief. How could he do this? How could he exclude me from such a significant moment in his life? I was his daughter, for crying out loud. Didn't that mean anything? I thought about calling my best friend, Jess. She'd understand. She'd been there through all the ups and downs of my relationship with Dad since the divorce. But the thought of explaining this, of saying the words out loud, was too much to bear. Instead, I curled up on my bed, clutching an old stuffed bear Dad had won for me at a carnival when I was 7. Sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, my mind a whirlwind of questions and what-ifs. What if I had been a better daughter? What if I had called more often? What if I hadn't moved out of state for college? Would things have been different? As the first rays of dawn crept through my curtains, I made a decision. I couldn't let this fester. I needed answers, and I needed them from Dad. With shaky hands, I grabbed my phone and typed out a message. "Dad, we need to talk. Can we meet?" The response came almost immediately. "Of course, sweetie. How about lunch today?" I agreed, my stomach churning with a mix of dread and determination. I spent the morning in a haze, going through the motions of getting ready without really seeing or feeling anything. The familiar streets of my hometown seemed alien as I drove to the diner where we'd had so many father-daughter meals over the years. Dad was already there when I arrived, sitting in our usual booth by the window. He stood up as I approached, his face a mask of concern and something else. Guilt, maybe? "Sarah," he said, pulling me into a hug that I reluctantly returned. I'm so glad you called. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The waitress came by with menus, but I waved her off. Food was the last thing on my mind. Why? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? Why wasn't I invited? Dad sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. It's complicated, sweetie. We wanted to keep it small, intimate. And I know you're busy with work and I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. Don't make excuses. I'm your daughter. I should have been there. The hurt in his eyes was palpable, but it did little to soothe the ache in my chest. We talked for hours, our untouched coffee growing cold as we navigated the minefield of emotions between us. Dad tried to explain, to justify, but each word only seemed to widen the gulf between us. As I left the diner that afternoon, I felt hollowed out. The father I thought I knew, the one who had taught me to ride a bike, who had cheered the loudest at my high school graduation, suddenly felt like a stranger. The uninvited silence that had descended upon our relationship echoed with every step I took away from him. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that things would never be the same. The easy camaraderie, the unspoken understanding we'd always shared, it had all been irreparably damaged. But amidst the pain and confusion, a small spark of determination flickered to life. This wasn't the end, I decided. It was a crossroads. And while I couldn't control my father's actions or decisions, I could control my own. I could choose to let this break me, or I could choose to grow from it. To learn, to heal, and maybe, someday, to forgive. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a promise to myself. I would face this head-on. I would confront the pain, work through it, and come out stronger on the other side. Because at the end of the day, I was more than just my father's daughter. I was Sarah. Resilient, determined, and capable of weathering any storm life threw my way. The uninvited silence that had descended upon my life was deafening, but I refused to let it be the final word in my story. The morning after my confrontation with Dad at the diner, I woke up feeling drained. The emotional toll of the past couple of days had left me exhausted, both mentally and physically. I dragged myself out of bed, my movement sluggish as I went through my morning routine. As I waited for my coffee to brew, I absent-mindedly scrolled through my phone. That's when I saw it, a notification from Instagram. Tom Johnson and 15 others you follow liked a post. Tom was my cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Curious, I tapped on the notification. My heart sank as the image loaded. It was a wedding photo. Not just any wedding photo, but one featuring my father, beaming in a sharp tuxedo, his arm around a radiant Linda in a beautiful white dress. The caption read, "Congratulations to the newlyweds." #wedding day, #love wins. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. This wasn't a small, intimate gathering as Dad had claimed. The photo showed a lavish setting, a grand ballroom decorated with elaborate floral arrangements, crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the guests. And there were so many guests. I recognized faces in the crowd, aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in years. There was Aunt Marge, Dad's sister, who I remembered for her boisterous laugh and penchant for bright, floral dresses. Uncle Pete stood nearby, his trademark handlebar mustache as prominent as ever. Even old Mr. Simmons, Dad's mentor from his early days at the law firm, was there, raising a glass in celebration. But what caught my eye and made my stomach churn were the unfamiliar faces. Young adults around my age, teenagers, even a couple of kids. They were clustered around Linda, their expressions a mix of joy and familial comfort. With a jolt, I realized these must be her children, maybe even grandchildren. My new siblings? Step-siblings? The thought made my head spin. I scrolled through more photos, each one a fresh stab to my heart. There was Dad cutting the cake with Linda, both laughing as they struggled to make a clean slice. Another showed them on the dance floor, lost in each other's eyes as they swayed to what I imagined was a romantic ballad. Yet another captured a group shot of what appeared to be Linda's entire family, brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, all gathered around the happy couple. The more I looked, the more I felt like an outsider peering into a world I should have been part of. Every smiling face, every candid moment of joy and celebration served as a stark reminder of my exclusion. This wasn't just a wedding, it was the merging of two families. Two families that, apparently, had no room for me. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in a daze of hurt and disbelief. The sharp beep of the coffee maker startled me back to reality. I realized my coffee had gone cold, much like the pit in my stomach. With trembling fingers, I dialed Jess's number. I needed my best friend now more than ever. "Hello?" Jess's voice was groggy with sleep. "Jess," I choked out, tears threatening to spill over. "I need you." Within 20 minutes, Jess was at my door, armed with a pint of my favorite ice cream and a sympathetic ear. We settled on my couch, and I poured out everything: the phone call, the confrontation at the diner, and now, the Instagram revelation. "Oh, Sarah," Jess said softly, pulling me into a hug. "I'm so sorry. This is awful." As I cried on her shoulder, Jess gently took my phone and scrolled through the photos. Her sharp intake of breath told me she understood the magnitude of what I was seeing. "This doesn't look like a small party at all," she muttered, her tone a mix of disbelief and anger on my behalf. "It's not just that," I sniffled, pulling away to look at her. It's a whole family, Jess. A family I knew nothing about. A family that doesn't include me." We spent hours poring over the photos, analyzing every detail. Jess, ever the pragmatist, tried to find logical explanations. Maybe it was a last-minute change of plans. Maybe Dad had tried to reach out but couldn't get hold of me. But even she couldn't deny the evidence before our eyes. This was a meticulously planned event, one that had clearly been in the works for months. As the day wore on, my initial shock and hurt began to give way to a simmering anger. How could Dad have lied to me so blatantly? How could he have excluded me from such a significant event in his life? The father I thought I knew, the man who had always preached honesty and family values, seemed like a stranger to me now. "You need to confront him again," Jess said as evening fell. "You deserve answers, Sarah. Real ones this time." I nodded, knowing she was right. But the thought of facing Dad again, armed with this new knowledge, filled me with dread. What if his explanations only hurt me more? What if this confrontation severed our relationship beyond repair? That night, sleep eluded me once again. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the wedding photos on an endless loop. I imagined myself there, in that grand ballroom. In some versions, I was a happy participant, dancing and laughing with my new extended family. In others, I was a ghost, invisible and unnoticed amidst the celebration. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I couldn't let this fester any longer. I needed answers, and I needed them now. With shaky hands, I picked up my phone and typed out a message to Dad: "We need to talk. In person. Today." His reply came almost instantly: "Of course, sweetie. Name the time and place." I suggested meeting at Riverside Park, a neutral ground that held no painful memories or associations. As I got ready to leave, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The person staring back at me looked different, older, harder somehow. I realized that regardless of how this conversation went, things would never be the same again. The drive to the park was a blur. My mind raced with all the questions I wanted to ask, all the hurt and anger I wanted to express. As I pulled into the parking lot, I spotted Dad's car already there. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself for what was to come. Dad was sitting on a bench overlooking the river, his posture tense as if bracing for impact. As I approached, he stood up, his face a mask of concern and what looked like genuine remorse. "Sarah," he began, but I cut him off. "I saw the photos, Dad," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "On Instagram. Some small party that was." The color drained from his face. For a moment, he looked like he might try to deny it or offer some explanation. But then his shoulders sagged, and he sank back onto the bench. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant to hurt you." As we sat there, the sound of the river flowing by a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions between us, Dad finally told me the whole story. How he'd met Linda's family, how they'd welcomed him with open arms, how the wedding had started as a small affair but had grown as more and more people wanted to be involved. "But why didn't you tell me?" I asked, fighting back tears. Why wasn't I part of it? Dad's explanation was a jumble of misguided intentions and poor decisions. He'd worried about how I'd react to his new relationship, feared that I might feel replaced or pushed aside. In trying to protect me, he'd ended up causing more pain than he could have imagined. As we talked, I realized that this wasn't just about the wedding. It was about years of miscommunication, of assumptions made and words left unsaid. The Instagram photos had merely been the catalyst, bringing to light issues that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. By the time we parted ways, the sun was setting over the river. Nothing had been resolved, not really. The hurt was still there, raw and pulsing. But at least now everything was out in the open. It was a start, however small. As I drove home, my mind still reeling from everything that had been said, I couldn't help but think about the people in those photos. Linda's children, my apparent new step-siblings. The extended family that I'd been so abruptly introduced to through a stranger's Instagram post. I wondered if they knew about me, if they'd asked why I wasn't at the wedding. The revelation had changed everything, opening up a Pandora's box of questions and uncertainties. But as I pulled into my driveway, I felt a glimmer of something that surprised me, hope. Because now that everything was out in the open, maybe, just maybe, we could start to rebuild. On new terms, with honesty and openness at the forefront. The Instagram revelation had shattered my world, but perhaps from those broken pieces, we could create something new. Something stronger. Only time would tell. The days following my confrontation with Dad at Riverside Park passed in a haze of conflicting emotions. I called in sick to work, unable to face the mundane tasks of shelving books and assisting customers when my personal life felt like it was crumbling around me. Instead, I found myself wandering through the rooms of my small apartment, touching familiar objects as if to anchor myself in a reality that suddenly felt unstable. My mind kept replaying the conversation with Dad, dissecting every word, every expression. His explanations, which had seemed so heartfelt in the moment, now rang hollow in the echo chamber of my thoughts. The more I mulled over his words, the more questions arose, each one adding another layer to the betrayal I felt. On the third day of my self-imposed isolation, I found myself standing in front of the closet in my spare room. It was where I kept boxes of old photos and mementos, pieces of my past that I rarely looked at but couldn't bear to throw away. With trembling hands, I pulled out a dusty shoebox labeled family stuff in my messy teenage scrawl. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, I began to sift through the contents. There were birthday cards from Dad, each one signed with his characteristic, "Love you to the moon and back, kiddo." Ticket stubs from baseball games we'd attended together, programs from my high school plays where he'd always sat in the front row. Each item was a tangible reminder of the relationship we'd once had, of the father I thought I knew. As I dug deeper, I came across a photo that made my breath catch in my throat. It was from my high school graduation, Dad and I, arms around each other, both beaming at the camera. I remembered that day so clearly. How proud he'd looked as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. How he'd thrown a big party afterward, inviting all our family and friends to celebrate. Family and friends. The words echoed in my mind, taking on a bitter taste. Where were those people now? Had they all been at the wedding, laughing and dancing while I remained oblivious? I found myself scrutinizing the photo, looking for signs of the man who would one day exclude me from one of the most important events of his life. But all I saw was my dad, the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had stayed up late helping me with math homework, who had hugged me fiercely when I left for college. The contrast between that man and the one I'd confronted in the park was stark and painful. It felt as though my own history had been rewritten without my consent, the narrative of my life altered by this one significant omission. I spent hours going through the box, each item stirring up memories both sweet and painful. There were photos from family vacations, trips to the beach, camping adventures in the mountains. I lingered over one particular picture from a trip to Yellowstone when I was 12. Dad and I stood in front of Old Faithful, waiting for it to erupt. I remembered how he'd explained the science behind the geyser, his eyes alight with enthusiasm as he shared his knowledge. That trip had been just the two of us, a special father-daughter getaway this summer after Mom left. It had been a time of healing, of reaffirming our bond in the face of change. Now, I couldn't help but wonder if he'd take similar trips with Linda's kids. Would he share the same experiences with them, creating new memories to replace the ones we'd made? As night fell, I found myself surrounded by the scattered remnants of my past. The floor was covered with photos, cards, and trinkets, each one a piece of the puzzle that was my relationship with Dad. But now, it felt like a crucial piece was missing, leaving the picture incomplete and distorted. I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I reached Dad's name. My finger hovered over the call button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. What would I say? How could I express the depth of hurt and confusion I was feeling? Instead, I opened my text messages, rereading our recent exchanges. They were mostly brief, mundane conversations, checking in about work, making plans for calls that often got postponed. Had there been signs that I'd missed? Hints of his new life that I'd overlooked? As I scrolled further back, I came across a message from several months ago. "Hey kiddo, need to reschedule our dinner this week. Work's crazy. Rain check?" At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. Now, I wondered if work had actually meant spending time with Linda and her family. The realization that our relationship had been built on half-truths and omissions for months hit me like a physical blow. How long had this been going on? How many times had he chosen his new family over me, all while I remained blissfully unaware? Sleep eluded me that night as my mind raced with questions and scenarios. I imagined Dad sitting down with Linda's children, explaining to them about his other daughter, the one who wasn't at the wedding. Did they know about me? Did they wonder why I wasn't part of their new, blended family? As dawn broke, casting a pale light through my curtains, I made a decision. I couldn't continue like this, trapped in a limbo of hurt and uncertainty. I needed to take action, to reclaim some sense of control over my life and my relationship with Dad. With newfound determination, I got up and showered, washing away the lethargy of the past few days. As I dressed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked different, older, perhaps, but also stronger. This betrayal had changed me, but I refused to let it break me. I sat down at my small desk, pulled out a notebook, and began to write. I poured out every thought, every question, every feeling that had been swirling in my mind. It was messy and raw, filled with crossed-out words and tear-stained pages, but it was honest. This wasn't just a letter to Dad. It was a declaration of my worth, a reminder to myself that I deserved better. As I wrote, I realized that this process wasn't just about confronting Dad. It was about confronting myself as well. I had to face the part of me that had always sought his approval, that had perhaps turned a blind eye to the gradual distancing in our relationship. I had to acknowledge my own role in allowing our connection to weaken over time. By the time I finished writing, the sun was high in the sky. I felt drained, but also oddly liberated. The act of putting my thoughts on paper had been cathartic, helping to clarify my feelings and my resolve. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Confronting Dad again, armed with this new understanding of my feelings, would be challenging. There was no guarantee that it would lead to reconciliation or understanding. But I also knew that I couldn't move forward without taking this step. As I sealed the letter in an envelope, I felt a mix of apprehension and determination. The echoes of betrayal still rang in my ears, but they were now accompanied by a new sound, the steady rhythm of my own strength, urging me forward. I picked up my phone and typed out a message to Dad. "I have something I need to say. Can we meet tomorrow?" His reply came quickly. "Of course, Sarah. Anytime, anywhere." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. The betrayal had shaken the foundation of our relationship, but perhaps from these tremors, something new and stronger could emerge. It was time to face the echoes head-on and see what remained once they faded away. The morning after I sent the text to Dad, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My dreams had been a chaotic mix of wedding scenes and childhood memories, leaving me more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. As I stumbled to the kitchen to make coffee, my phone buzzed with a text from Dad. How about we meet at the Maple Street Cafe at 2 p.m.? I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the reply button. The Maple Street Cafe was where we used to go for Sunday brunches when I was a kid. It felt like a lifetime ago now. Was this Dad's attempt at nostalgia, or just a convenient meeting spot? After a moment's hesitation, I typed back a simple, "Okay," and hit send. The hours until our meeting crawled by at an agonizing pace. I tried to distract myself by cleaning my apartment, but every object I touched seemed to hold a memory. The framed photo of Dad and me at my college graduation. The old guitar he'd taught me to play on. Even the chipped mug I was drinking my coffee from, a Father's Day gift from years ago. By the time I left for the cafe, my emotions were a tangled mess. Anger, hurt, confusion, and a stubborn flicker of hope all warred within me. The letter I'd written lay folded in my purse, its weight seeming to grow with each step I took. The Maple Street Cafe looked exactly as I remembered it, the red checkered tablecloths, the old-fashioned jukebox in the corner, the smell of coffee and syrup hanging in the air. For a moment, I was transported back in time, half expecting to see my younger self sliding into a booth across from Dad, eager to tell him about my week at school. The illusion shattered as I spotted him at a table near the back. He looked older than I remembered, the lines around his eyes more pronounced, his hair grayer. When he saw me, he stood up, an uncertain smile on his face. "Sarah," he said, his voice a mix of relief and apprehension. "Thanks for meeting me." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. We sat down, and an awkward silence fell between us. Dad fidgeted with his napkin, his eyes darting between me and the menu on the table. "Do you want to order something?" he asked finally. "They still make those blueberry pancakes you used to love." The mention of the pancakes brought a fresh wave of memories. Lazy Sunday mornings, Dad letting me pour too much syrup on my stack, both of us laughing as it dripped onto the table. I pushed the thoughts away, steeling myself for what I needed to say. "I'm not here for pancakes, Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm here because we need to talk." "Really talk?" Dad's shoulders sagged slightly, but he nodded. "You're right. I owe you that much, at least." I took a deep breath and pulled out the letter from my purse. "I wrote this last night," I explained. "I need you to read it. All of it. And then we can talk." As Dad began to read, I watched his face carefully. I saw his brow furrow, his lips tighten, his eyes grow moist. Several times he looked like he wanted to say something, but I shook my head. He needed to hear, or rather, read, everything I had to say without interruption. When he finally looked up from the last page, his eyes were red-rimmed. "Oh, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry." The apology, though sincere, felt inadequate in the face of everything I'd poured out in that letter. All the hurt, the confusion, the feeling of being replaced and forgotten. But it was a start. "Why, Dad?" I asked, the question that had been burning inside me for days finally spilling out. "Why didn't you tell me? Why wasn't I there?" Dad ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. I thought I was protecting you," he said. "Linda and we got serious so quickly. And her family, they were all so welcoming. I was afraid you'd feel left out or think I was trying to replace you and your mom. So instead, you just cut me out completely?" The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. "No, I didn't mean to," Dad protested. It got away from me. The wedding plans grew bigger than we intended, and I kept putting off telling you, thinking I'd find the right moment. And then suddenly it was happening and I panicked. I convinced myself it would be easier to ask forgiveness than to try to explain. As he spoke, I felt a storm of emotions swirling inside me. Anger at his choices, hurt at being excluded, but also a flicker of understanding. I remembered times when I'd put off telling him things, afraid of his reaction or disappointing him. "Dad," I said, my voice softening slightly. "I'm not a child anymore. You don't need to protect me from your life. I want to be part of it, all of it, even the parts that might be complicated or difficult." He reached across the table, hesitating before placing his hand over mine. "I know that now," he said. "Reading your letter, Sarah, I've been so wrong. So stupid. I never meant to make you feel like you weren't important to me. You're my daughter, and I love you more than anything in this world. The sincerity in his voice made my throat tighten. I wanted to believe him, wanted to forgive and move past this. But the hurt was still too raw, the betrayal too fresh. I need time, Dad, I said, gently pulling my hand away. I can't just forget what happened. I don't know if things can ever be the same between us. Dad nodded, a look of resignation and sadness crossing his face. I understand. I know I've damaged our relationship, maybe beyond repair. But Sarah, I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. If you'll let me, I want to try to rebuild what we had. To be the father you deserve. As we sat there in the cafe, surrounded by the ghosts of happier times, I felt the storm within me begin to calm. Not entirely. There were still dark clouds on the horizon, questions that needed answering, trust that needed rebuilding. But for the first time since I'd learned about the wedding, I felt a glimmer of hope. I'd like that, I said finally. But it's going to take time. And effort. From both of us. Dad's face lit up with cautious hope. I'm willing to put in that effort, Sarah. For as long as it takes. We spent the next hour talking, really talking, in a way we hadn't in years. Dad told me more about Linda, about her children, and how they'd come into his life. I shared my fears and insecurities, the ways his actions had affected me. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when old hurts flared up, threatening to derail our progress. But we pushed through, both of us committed to this new, fragile understanding we were building. As we left the cafe, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. Dad hesitated at his car, looking at me with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Can I give you a hug? He asked tentatively. For a moment, I hesitated. Then, almost despite myself, I nodded. As Dad's arms wrapped around me, I felt something inside me shift. The storm wasn't over. There would be more difficult conversations, more emotions to navigate. But in that moment, I allowed myself to feel like his daughter again, to remember the safety and love I'd always associated with his hugs. As we parted, Dad smiled at me, a real smile, tinged with sadness, but also with hope. Thank you, Sarah, he said, for giving me this chance. I promise I won't let you down again. I nodded, not quite ready to make any promises of my own. But as I drove home, I felt lighter than I had in days. The storm within me had calmed, at least for now. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, I felt ready to walk it. That night, as I got ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed different, stronger, more resilient. I realized that this ordeal, painful as it had been, had forced me to confront not just my relationship with Dad, but my own identity and strength. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the future, about family dinners that might include Linda and her children, about rebuilding trust with Dad one conversation at a time. It wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to face whatever came next. The storm within had raged, but from its chaos, I had emerged stronger, more sure of myself and what I needed from my relationships. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new emotions to navigate. But for now, I allowed myself to rest, knowing that I had taken the first step towards healing, towards reclaiming my place in my father's life, on my own terms. The days following my meeting with Dad at the Maple Street Cafe were a whirlwind of emotions. While our conversation had opened the door to reconciliation, I knew we were far from resolving all our issues. The hurt and betrayal still lingered, mingling with a cautious hope for the future. I found myself oscillating between moments of optimism and bouts of doubt, unsure of how to move forward. It was during one of these moments of uncertainty that I decided I needed a more structured approach to dealing with the situation. Simply reacting to events as they unfolded wasn't enough anymore. I needed to take control, to actively shape the future of my relationship with Dad. With this realization, I embarked on what I began to think of as Operation Confrontation. It started small, jotting down thoughts and questions in a notebook I kept by my bed. But soon, it evolved into something more comprehensive. I cleared a space on the wall of my spare room, tacking up a large corkboard. This became my planning center. I wrote down every question I wanted to ask Dad, every grievance I needed to air, every hope I had for our future relationship. Each item went on its own index card, color-coded by category: blue for questions about the wedding, yellow for issues related to Linda and her family, green for my own emotional needs. As I stood back and looked at the board, the sheer volume of cards was overwhelming. How could I possibly address all of this in one conversation? That's when I realized I couldn't. This wasn't going to be a single confrontation, but a series of conversations, a process of rebuilding our relationship piece by piece. I called my best friend, Jess, and asked her to come over. When she arrived and saw my confrontation board, her eyes widened. "Wow, Sarah," she said, taking it all in. "This is intense." I nodded, suddenly feeling a bit self-conscious. "Too much?" Jess shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "No, it's very you. Organized, thorough. But are you sure you're ready for all this?" Her question gave me pause. Was I ready? The board represented hours of soul-searching, of dragging painful thoughts and memories into the light. But looking at it now, I felt a sense of empowerment. I was taking charge of my own healing process. "I think I have to be," I replied. "I can't just let things go back to the way they were. We need to address all of this if we're going to move forward." Jess nodded, her expression serious. "Okay then. How can I help?" Over the next few hours, Jess and I refined my plan. We grouped similar topics together, creating a rough outline for a series of conversations. We discussed strategies for staying calm and focused, even if things got emotional. Jess even role-played as Dad, allowing me to practice expressing my feelings without getting overwhelmed. As we worked, I felt a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about confronting Dad anymore. It was about advocating for myself, about ensuring that my needs and feelings were acknowledged and respected. The next day, I called Dad and asked if we could meet again. "There's a lot we still need to talk about," I told him. "I've been thinking about everything, and I have some things I want to discuss." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Dad spoke, his voice was a mixture of apprehension and relief. "Of course, Sarah. I've been hoping we could talk more. When and where would you like to meet?" We agreed to meet at a local park the following weekend. A neutral space, away from the memories associated with the cafe or our homes. As I hung up the phone, I felt a flutter of nervousness in my stomach. This was really happening. The days leading up to our meeting were a blur of preparation. I refined my notes, practiced what I wanted to say, and tried to anticipate Dad's responses. Jess came over again, providing moral support and a much-needed reality check when I started to overthink things. "Remember," she said as we sat on my couch the night before the big day, "you don't have to solve everything in one go. This is just the start of the process." I nodded, grateful for her steadying presence. "I know. I want to get it right, you know." Jess squeezed my hand. "You will. Just be honest, be open, and remember to breathe." The morning of the meeting, I woke up early, my mind already racing. I went through my normal routine on autopilot: shower, coffee, breakfast, all while mentally reviewing my talking points. As I got dressed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed different from the one who had first learned about the wedding. There was a determination in her eyes, a set to her jaw that spoke of newfound strength. I arrived at the park 15 minutes early, choosing a bench near the duck pond. As I waited, I watched families feed the ducks, children laughing and chasing each other on the grass. I found myself wondering if this was what it would be like at family gatherings now. Dad with Linda and her kids, me on the periphery, trying to find my place. The thought brought a pang of sadness, but also a renewed sense of purpose. That was exactly why this conversation was so important. I needed to carve out my own space in this new family dynamic to ensure that I wasn't left behind or forgotten. I saw Dad before he saw me. He was walking along the path, his pace slow and measured. When he spotted me, he raised a hand in greeting, a tentative smile on his face. As he got closer, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the worry lines creasing his forehead. "Hi, Sarah," he said as he reached the bench. "Is it okay if I sit?" I nodded, gesturing to the space beside me. For a moment, we sat in silence, watching the ducks paddle across the pond. Then, taking a deep breath, I turned to face him. "Dad," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since we last talked. About the wedding, about our relationship, about everything. And I realized there's still so much we need to address." Dad nodded, his expression a mix of apprehension and resignation. "I understand. I've been thinking a lot too. About how I've let you down, about all the things I should have done differently." I pulled out a small notebook from my bag, a condensed version of my confrontation board. "I've made some notes," I explained. "Things I want to talk about, questions I need answers to. Is that okay?" "Of course," Dad said, his voice soft. "Whatever you need, Sarah. I'm here to listen." And so began the most honest, raw conversation I'd ever had with my father. I started with the wedding, asking him to walk me through the decision-making process that led to my exclusion. It wasn't easy. There were moments when my voice shook, when tears threatened to spill over. But I pushed through, determined to get everything out in the open. Dad listened, really listened, in a way he hadn't in years. He answered my questions as best he could, not making excuses, but trying to explain his thought process. When he couldn't answer, he admitted it, promising to think about it and get back to me. We talked about Linda and her family, about my fears of being replaced or forgotten. Dad reassured me of my place in his life, while also helping me understand the complexity of blending families. It wasn't a simple situation, but his willingness to discuss it openly gave me hope. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, I realized we'd been talking for hours. We hadn't resolved everything, far from it. But we'd made a start, laid a foundation for the difficult conversations still to come. As we stood to leave, Dad hesitated, then pulled me into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, Sarah," he whispered. "For your strength, for your honesty. I know this isn't easy, but I promise you, we'll figure it out together." Walking back to my car, I felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The confrontation I'd planned so meticulously had gone better than I'd dared to hope. It wasn't an ending, but a beginning, the first step on a long road of healing and rebuilding. As I drove home, I found myself looking forward to the future for the first time in weeks. There would be more difficult conversations, more emotions to navigate, but I felt equipped to handle them now. I had found my voice, my strength. And with it, the hope that someday, somehow, we could forge a new kind of family, one that had room for all of us. The weeks following my confrontation with Dad in the park were a roller coaster of emotions. There were days when I felt hopeful, energized by the progress we'd made. Other days, the weight of everything that had happened would come crashing down, leaving me wondering if we could ever truly repair our relationship. I threw myself into work at the bookstore, finding solace in the familiar routines of shelving books and helping customers. My coworker, Mike, noticed the change in my demeanor and asked if everything was okay. "Family stuff," I said with a shrug, not ready to dive into the whole story. Mike nodded sympathetically. "Family can be tough. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." His kindness brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I'd been so focused on my relationship with Dad that I'd almost forgotten the support system I had around me. That night, I called Jess and filled her in on everything that had happened since our meeting in the park. She listened patiently, offering words of encouragement and support. "You're doing great, Sarah," she said. "Remember, healing isn't linear. There will be good days and bad days. The important thing is that you're moving forward." Her words stuck with me, becoming a mantra of sorts as I navigated the uncertain waters of my new reality. A few days later, I received a text from Dad. "Would you like to have dinner with Linda and me this weekend? No pressure if you're not ready." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply button. Part of me wanted to say no, to retreat into the safety of avoidance. But I knew that if I wanted things to change, I had to be willing to take risks. "Okay," I typed back. "Saturday at 7? Dad's response was almost immediate. "Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. This means a lot." As Saturday approached, my anxiety grew. I found myself standing in front of my closet, agonizing over what to wear. It felt silly. I was having dinner with my dad and his wife, not attending a job interview. But somehow, the choice of outfit seemed crucially important. I finally settled on a simple blue dress, comfortable but nice enough for a dinner out. As I applied a light layer of makeup, I gave myself a pep talk in the mirror. "You can do this," I told my reflection. "Just be honest, be open, and remember to breathe." The restaurant Dad had chosen was a cozy Italian place downtown. As I walked in, I spotted them at a table near the back. Dad stood up when he saw me, a nervous smile on his face. Linda remained seated, but she offered a warm smile and a small wave. "Sarah," Dad said as I approached. "I'm so glad you could make it." I nodded, suddenly feeling tongue-tied. Linda stood up, extending her hand. "It's wonderful to see you again, Sarah. Thank you for joining us." As we sat down, an awkward silence fell over the table. I busied myself with the menu, using it as a shield to gather my thoughts. "So," Dad said after we'd ordered, "how have you been?" It was such a normal question, the kind of thing you'd ask an acquaintance you bumped into at the grocery store. But coming from Dad, in this context, it felt loaded with meaning. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of all the preparation I'd done. "I've been processing," I said honestly. "It's been a lot to take in." Dad nodded, his expression a mix of guilt and concern. "I understand. And I want you to know how sorry I am, Sarah. For everything." Linda reached over and placed her hand on Dad's. "We both are," she added. "We handled things poorly, and we're truly sorry for the pain we've caused you." Her inclusion of herself in the apology caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on Dad that I hadn't really considered Linda's role in all of this. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I appreciate that." As the evening progressed, the conversation gradually became easier. We talked about my job at the bookstore, about Dad's latest cases at the law firm. Linda, I learned, was a high school English teacher. We found common ground discussing our favorite books, the tension slowly easing as we chatted. When the topic inevitably turned to the wedding and the events that followed, I was surprised to find that I could discuss it without the overwhelming anger and hurt I'd felt before. It still stung, but the sharp edges of the pain had dulled somewhat. "I want you to be part of our lives, Sarah," Dad said as we were finishing our dessert. "If you're willing. I know it won't be easy, and I know we have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust. But I want to try." I looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in years. I saw the lines of worry etched on his face, the hope and fear warring in his eyes. And I saw my dad, flawed, human, but trying. "I want that too," I said softly. "But it's going to take time. And effort. From all of us." Linda nodded. "Of course. We're willing to put in that effort, Sarah. Whatever you need." As we left the restaurant, Dad pulled me into a hug. It wasn't the easy, comfortable hugs we used to share, but it wasn't as stiff and awkward as it had been recently either. It was a hug of new beginnings, of cautious hope. The next few months were a period of adjustment and growth. Dad and I started having regular coffee dates, just the two of us. Sometimes we talked about deep, emotional topics. Other times, we just enjoyed each other's company. Slowly but surely, we were rebuilding our relationship on a new foundation of honesty and mutual respect. I also started spending time with Linda, getting to know her as a person rather than just Dad's wife. To my surprise, I found that I genuinely liked her. She was kind, intelligent, and she clearly cared for Dad. While she could never replace my mom, I began to see how she could be a positive addition to our family. The first time I met Linda's children was at a backyard barbecue at Dad and Linda's house. I'd been nervous about it for weeks, imagining all sorts of worst-case scenarios. But as I watched Dad flip burgers on the grill, chatting easily with Linda's teenage son about his latest football game, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. Linda's daughter, Emma, who was close to my age, approached me with a shy smile. "I'm really glad you could make it," she said. Your dad, talks about you all the time." Her words warmed something inside me. Maybe there was room for all of us in this new family after all. As summer turned to fall, I found myself looking forward to family gatherings rather than dreading them. They weren't always easy. There were still moments of awkwardness, of old hurts resurfacing. But we were learning to navigate these challenges together. One crisp October evening, as I was leaving Dad and Linda's house after dinner, Dad walked me to my car. "Sarah," he said, his voice serious, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. The strength you've shown, the grace you've extended to all of us. I couldn't ask for a better daughter." Tears pricked at my eyes. "Thanks, Dad," I whispered, pulling him into a hug. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey of the past few months. The pain of the wedding exclusion still lingered, a scar that might never fully fade. But it no longer defined my relationship with Dad or my place in our evolving family. I thought about the woman I'd been when this all started, hurt, angry, feeling lost and alone. And I thought about who I was now, stronger, more resilient, with a deeper understanding of myself and my relationships. The road ahead wasn't clear or easy. There would be more challenges to face, more difficult conversations to have. But as I pulled into my driveway, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. We were writing a new chapter in our family story, one of forgiveness, growth, and new beginnings. As I got ready for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was changed, not just by the events of the past months, but by how she'd chosen to respond to them. She was a woman who had faced betrayal and come out stronger, who had learned to stand up for herself while also extending grace to others. I smiled at my reflection, feeling a surge of pride and hope. The dawn of this new chapter in my life wasn't just about my relationship with Dad or finding my place in our blended family. It was about the person I was becoming, resilient, compassionate, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of anticipation for the future. It wouldn't always be easy, but I was ready. Ready to continue growing, to keep building these new relationships, and to embrace the beautiful, messy complexity of family in all its forms.